19th century was a period during which world exhibitions thrived. The French held 4 World Expos in Paris in 1844, 1855, 1867, 1878 and 1889, as well as the French Industrial Exposition of 1844. Other world fairs were held 6 times in other countries during that century. The period between 1889 and the 1900 Expo was one of relative peace, although France suffered a number of setbacks like the failure to construct the Panama Canal, the loss of Egypt to Britain and the Dreyfuss affair in 1898. Looking at this map, 5 distinct areas can be identified. The official entrance to the Expo, the so-called Porte Monumental, was located at the Place de la Concorde, close to the Pont Alexandre III. First of all, there was the area along an avenue called the Esplanade des Invalides, running from the Dôme des Invalides to the River Seine. 2 magnificent buildings were constructed at the beginning of this avenue, the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais. These 2 palaces are the only ones to survive the Paris 1900 Expo, and nowadays are museums that house art and other exhibitions. Along the River Seine, between the Eiffel Tower and the Pont Alexandre III, was the second area called Le Quai des Nations. Here one would find the pavilions of primarily European countries. The third area was on the opposite side of the Seine, thus facing Le Quai des Nations, where a small village was built representing old Paris from around the Middle Ages. Fourth is the area between the Eiffel Tower and the École Militaire, which was reserved for the building of many theme palaces. This is the famous Champ de Mars. More about these palaces later. The last and 5th area across the River Seine, as seen from the Eiffel Tower, adjacent to the beautiful Trocadero Palace, was reserved for pavilions of the French colonies and other countries outside of Europe. The 5 main exposition areas that were identified earlier in this documentary will now be addressed in far more detail. On some days, more than 100,000 visitors passed through the monumental entrance gate. This gate was constructed as a richly ornamented arch and had 3 arches facing each other at the base and supporting a low dome. On top was the famous statue of La Parisienne, welcoming the visitors, thus making the whole structure 45 meters high. The arch was illuminated by 3,200 tiny electric lights, a novelty in 1900. 2 35-meter tall minarets also sided the grandiose arch. Once through the gate, visitors would follow the embankment of the River Seine, and once arrived at the Pont Alexandre III, had 3 choices of how to proceed further. By turning right, they could visit the Grand Palais and Petit Palais. Continuing straight on would lead to Paris Vieux Village. And by turning left, they would cross the Pont Alexandre III to visit the palaces along the Esplanade des Invalides and finally end up 1 kilometer further at the Dôme des Invalides, or to turn first right after the bridge to visit the Cité des Nations. The Grand Palais was and still is not only grand by design but also by size, being 200 meters long, 45 meters deep and with a 43 meter high spectacular glass dome that makes the exhibits inside bathe in light. It was built to exhibit fine arts, paintings, sculptures, ornaments and more by French and foreign artists. Under the central dome, magnificent sculptures were on display, as seen here. Although much smaller, the Petit Palais across the road was most certainly not less impressive. It was a magnificent architectural achievement. Its facade was and still is in Louis XVI style. The palace showed a collection of artistic wealth, jewels, armor, enamels and furniture. Behind the palace was a courtyard with a beautiful colonnade and a splendid garden. The Esplanade des Invalides was a mishmash of great facades consisting of openwork towers, watchtowers and bell towers in Rococo and Baroque style. Collectively they formed the Décoration and the Céramique des Industries Diverses, bordering both sides of the esplanade. Thus these palaces were mainly dedicated to decorative creative arts, porcelain, ceramics, glassmaking, furniture and other related industries, divided into a French and a foreign section. Here we see one of the impressive buildings, le Palais de la Décoration. The other sides of these palaces along the esplanade were most certainly also worth a visit, like le Palais des Industries Diverses. Sadly, the palace's facades were built too close together, over 3/4 of the length of the esplanade. Instead of offering a magnificent broad view with the Dôme des Invalides at the end as its eye-catching centerpiece, a narrow street emerged, leading to a dead end. Other palaces along the Esplanade des Invalides, the Vestibule du Grand Escalier in the German section, was certainly worth a visit. These buildings were not constructed to last and were built more like a Hollywood film set that could easily be taken down. Visit the Cité des Nations. We begin our journey on the side of the Pont Alexandre III. The first pavilion, taking up a lot of space, is that of Italy, just past the Pont des Invalides. It is in splendid Baroque style, with in its center a magnificent gold-covered dome reproducing the main dome of the Cathedral of St. Mark. It does open the line of official foreign pavilions magnificently. Next we see the Pavilion of Turkey, being a lot smaller than its Italian neighbor, and in typical Oriental Ottoman style, also crowned with a dome. The building held interesting elements of the principal monuments of Constantinople, today's Istanbul. Inside were small bazaar shops, wonders of Turkish industry, as well as carpets, fabrics and other Turkish arts and crafts. The third pavilion is that of the United States. It has about the same size and is also equipped with a dome. The golden eagles give it extra splendor. It bears some resemblance with the central section of the US Capitol building in Washington. The main facade of this pavilion, facing the Seine, consists of a triumphal arch decorated with large Corinthian columns supporting a quadriga, all illuminated with gold, representing the goddess of liberty on the chariot of progress. The pavilion did not contain any exhibits, but was more a meeting place for American visitors. The Pavilion of the United States was an exception. The other buildings on the quay all represented European nations. Austria, under the auspices of Kaiser Franz Joseph, made great effort to display its country's assets and achievement at this World Fair. Inside was a great collection of paintings and other Austrian art. Next we see the Pavilion of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was built as a reminder to the time during which the country was under Turkish Ottoman rule. It was in the style of Ottoman stately residences. Inside was an exhibition of all the products of the two provinces Bosnia and Herzegovina. Next to it is the Hungarian pavilion in recognizable Bohemian style. Its rough Hun appearance stood in sharp contrast with the sophistication of its neighboring Austrian pavilion. The 40-meter high tower was a reproduction of the Kermox-Bania castle. Moving further along the river Seine, we see the slightly underwhelming pavilion of the United Kingdom. It bears some resemblance with Bletchley House, with Tudor-style chimneys, like a typical English manor house, including green lawns. The house functioned as a reception during the visit of the Prince of Wales to the exhibition. The interior was fitted out like a modern English pleasure home, with many splendidly decorated rooms and a spectacular hall fit for a palace. The bridge next to it gives the impression that the empty space was originally reserved for another country that did not turn up at the Expo. Belgium decided to build a pavilion as a copy of the town hall of Oudenaarde, dating from 1530. The roof and outer walls were lavishly decorated with statues. This immense building was more or less empty and disappointing to visitors who had just before been to splendid adjacent pavilions. Entirely made of wood, the Norwegian pavilion building presented the type of rural construction of the Scandinavian country. The adjacent German pavilion was a typical model of 16th century German civil architecture and represented a mixture of German town halls and other public buildings. It had a brightly colorful painted facade and thus stood out among the other buildings in the Cité des Nations. Inside, several rooms contained a very interesting exhibition of German books, engravings and photographs. Rooms not open to the regular public contained the imperial collection of Kaiser Wilhelm, with many precious works of art. Many other art treasures were on display as well. The building also contained a splendid section called the Cœur d'Honneur. Spain's pavilion was in Spanish Renaissance style and inspired by a multitude of famous buildings like the facade of the University of Alcalá, the main facade of the Alcázar of Toledo, the University of Salamanca, and also the Palace of the Counts of Monterrey. Next to Spain's pavilion we see that of Monaco. Surprising to see such an impressive building brought to the Expo by such a small, almost irrelevant European nation. Nevertheless, Monaco's then Prince Albert took the opportunity to display parts of the ancient Monegasque residence of the Grimaldis. Sweden's pavilion was a weird concoction of turrets, belfries and masts linked together by footbridges. The whole building was constructed out of fir wood. The Hellenic pavilion was inspired by one of the types of the Greek churches of Mystra. Its central dome was supported on a polygon drum by trumpets, which transferred the loads to 8 intermediate support points. Its roof and the walls were pink, interlaced with turquoise. Next, the picturesque pavilion of Serbia was built in Byzantine style, with a large central dome surrounded by 4 smaller domes on each corner of the building. Behind the Quai des Nations, along the Rue des Nations, were the palaces of Denmark, Portugal, Peru, Persia, Mexico, Luxembourg, Bulgaria and Romania. Other palaces along the river Seine were le Palais de la Navigation de Commerce, le Pavillon de Creusot, dedicated to the military industries, le Palais de Hygiène Armée de Terre et de Mer, with a huge old warship alongside its quay, le Palais de la Danse, opposite the Spanish Palace, le Palais de l'Horticulture, opposite the Quai des Nations. Last but not least, the wonderful Globe Celeste, a 45-meter high globe with a flower deck on top. Its interior represented heaven. Visitors could sit in a chair while panoramas of the solar system passed over. Sadly, my own country, the Netherlands, did not get a spot on the Rue des Nations, but did construct buildings primarily dedicated to the Dutch colonies of Indonesia in the Trocadero area. Being frugal as ever, the Netherlands had no more money to spend on a national pavilion. The old Paris village gave a magnificent impression of what Paris used to be like centuries before. Many old houses decorated the cobbled old streets, and hordes of hired actors reenacted daily life and did street performances in the form of tableaux vivants. One of the replicas was the Grand Châtelet, as it was during the reign of King Louis XII. There also was a large aquarium along the banks of the Seine. Numerous merchants were running small shops inside the village. We will now focus on the area below the Eiffel Tower, towards the École Militaire, called the Champ de Mars. During the Expo, this military school was completely obscured from view. 2 huge buildings were constructed in front of it, le Palais d'Électricité and the La Galerie des Machines Électriques, which had already been constructed for the 1889 Expo. A rather ugly building, but for that period an engineering marvel, considering its construction of enormous 110 wide and 48 meters high steel curved trusses and glass house-alike ceiling panels. Its length was 420 meters. Here we see some of the early electricity generators. Inside the hall was a huge party venue, La Salle des Fêtes. At the time of the opening of the fair, an enormous dinner was held for many of the mayors of France. The emphasis of the pavilions along the Champ de Mars was science, technology and industry. Thus there were pavilions dedicated to chemistry, mines, metallurgy, new means of transport, agriculture, the manufacture of cloth and clothes, especially electricity, and much more. During the 1900 Expo, the French Exhibition of Agriculture and Food was held, the highlight of which was a full-size replica of the ship Le Triomphant, designed by the Meunier Company. In front of the Galerie des Machines stood the magnificent Palais d'Électricité and Château d'Eau, i.e. the water castle. It stood out as probably the most spectacular building of the fair, with extensive ponds, fountains and a waterfall splashing down its facade as if coming from a water grotto. This represented the allegory humanity led by progress advancing towards the future. On top of the chateau was a gilded statue of a goddess, at night radiating light in all directions, a truly spectacular sight. Just behind the Château d'Eau was the spectacular Palais des Illusions. It was a wonderfully decorated hall filled with mirrors and lights that stunned the visitors. The interior of this palace is one of the few that survived the Expo, and till this day can be visited at the wax figures Musée Grévin. The Palace of Mines and Metallurgy was a whole world of machines, forges, metals, coals and other raw materials. In 1900, iron, steel and other metals like zinc were becoming more popular industrial construction materials. Le Tour du Monde, being the World Tour panorama, in effect only showed a collection of European and Asian paintings. The building itself was a mix of an Indian temple, Chinese pagoda and a European Renaissance-style pavilion. Here is a glimpse inside one of the palaces showing the perfumery. In the shadow of the Eiffel Tower stood the Palace of Optics, where an enormous 60-meter long and 1.5-meter diameter telescope was on display. Other palaces along the Champ de Mars were Le Palais des Fils, Tissus et Vêtements, dedicated to threads, cloth and clothes. Le Palais des Lettres, Sciences et Arts, near the south foot of the Eiffel Tower. Le Musée Rétrospectif de Costumes. Le Palais Lumineux, right beside the Eiffel Tower. The last and fifth area across the River Seine, as seen from the Eiffel Tower, adjacent to the beautiful Trocadero Palace, was reserved for pavilions of the French colonies and other countries outside of Europe. Sadly, the Trocadero Palace became dilapidated and was demolished in 1935 in preparation of the 1937 Expo. We first visit the French colonies, starting with Morocco. Its pavilion resembled an Arabian mosque and was surrounded by a bazaar with narrow streets. Next is the Algerian pavilion in typical North African style. Its main facade reproduced the entrance to the mosque of Sultan Baja in Oran. Tunisia at the time of the Expo was a French protectorate. Its pavilion was dedicated to the display of local produce, some examples being oranges, lemons, almonds, dates, figs, apricots, medlars, pomegranates, bananas, guavas, etc. French Guiana was represented at the fair with a large chief's hut, comprising two circular huts with conical roofs and joined by an outer gallery with a thatched roof. An Indo-Chinese city had also been built at Trocadero, involving 5 main buildings or groups of buildings, like Tonkinese, Cambodian and Laotian houses. The pavilion of Sudan and Senegal was an exact reproduction of a large mosque-like palace on the banks of the Niger River. Among other, the building contained the treasure of Ahmadou, the former Sultan of Saizam, consisting of magnificent gold jewellery of a very particular workmanship. As already mentioned, the Netherlands built a pavilion dedicated to Indonesia in this area. It consisted of a Java village, plus a house with a curled roof in typical Sumatra Minangkabau style. Russia also had a, particularly by the French, greatly admired pavilion very close to the Trocadero Palace. Friendship between France and Russia was at a very high level in 1900. It was built in old Russian style in the form of a Kremlin and was surrounded by turrets that were decorated with gold and bright colors. In 1900 there was a great reform of the beverage tax, aimed at diminishing the abuse of alcoholic beverages and to combat drunkenness. The Régie des Alcools had a special pavilion on the Champ de Mars near the Eiffel Tower, the so named Alcool Russe Pavilion. There were 4 Chinese pavilions at the fair in the Trocadero area, not far from the Siberia Pavilion, surrounded by lush vegetation. The main pavilion was a very good reproduction of a Peking gate, surmounted by a small imperial kiosk known as the Drum Palace, as well as a copy of a kiosk in Peking's Forbidden City. The 4th building was another gate, being an imitation of the famous Confucius Gate. These palaces contained collections of retrospective and modern art, beautiful silks, potiches, Buddhas, precious and bizarre trinkets, as well as industrial products. The Palais des Femmes at the foot of the Eiffel Tower had a feministic character dedicated to the history of women. It showed in which trades women were involved in France and beyond. Other palaces in the Trocadero area were Le Palais de l'Égypte, Le Palais de la Serbie, i.e. Serbia, Le Village Laotien from Laos, Le Pavillon de Siam, nowadays Thailand. Plenty of restaurants were present at the fair, one being the interesting Kammerzijl restaurant, a copy of a house in Strasbourg. Le Pavillon Bleu, a great Art Nouveau restaurant. The Swiss village was a unique attraction. A completely artificial 30-meter high mountain had been constructed with a number of cottages, meadows, cattle and a crew of 300 Swiss acting as farmers, their wives and dancing villagers. The mountain was constructed on flat land deploying a steel frame, fake rocks and earth mounds. Unfortunately the vista was somewhat spoiled by the large Ferris wheel towering over the exhibit. La Grande Roue de Paris Ferris wheel was another very popular attraction. The wheel had an unsurpassed enormous diameter of 93 meters and was made of steel. The wheel stood for 20 years and was demolished between 1920 and 1922. One of the engineering marvels of the Expo was the Pont Alexandre III bridge, dedicated to Russia's ruler. This wonderful bridge had a span of 107.3 meters and a width of 40 meters and is beautifully decorated. The bridge astonished visitors and was admired for its design and structure. Its framework, composed of 15 parallel arches of cast steel that stretched across the river, rested on granite foundations. Beautiful stone staircases led from the footpaths along the river bank up to street level. 4 magnificent decorated pylons with gilded ornaments on top marked the beginning and end of both sides of the bridge. The moving sidewalk, called the Rue de l'Avenir, was a novelty that attracted and amazed many visitors. The sidewalk had 3 lanes, 1 not moving lane and 2 that had wooden platforms that respectively moved at speeds of 5 and 8 km per hour. People had lots of fun changing lanes and sometimes falling over while doing so. Other places of interest were l'Exposition des Plantes, not far away from the Expo, Le Pavillon et Tour de Sauvetage at the Bois de Vincennes, also not far from the Expo, the Persian Palace, where these dancers were to be seen. As a Dutch YouTube channel, we should not fail to mention the small pavilion-shaped Heineken beer tasting bar, and to commemorate that this beer brewer received the Diplôme de Grand Prix for the outstanding quality of its beer during the preceding 1889 Paris World Fair. This pavilion was located inside a large other pavilion. We were not able to identify its location on the Expo. To sum up, in effect the 1900 Paris Expo was a huge success. In total 23 European nations, 17 foreign nations and 15 French colonies participated, involving 83,000 exhibitors, and had about 50 million visitors in its period of existence between the 15th of April 1900 and the 12th of November 1900. On some peak days more than 100,000 visitors passed through its entrance gate. The introduction of electricity was the star of the show. Clearly the 1900 World Fair at Paris was an impressive spectacle and admirable achievement. It was the epiphany of the miracles of modern technology progress in that period of time that followed the late 19th century Industrial Revolution. It demonstrated the abilities, achievements and advancements of the French nation, and till this day is something that the French can be extremely proud of. It's no wonder that France for a long time had an air of chauvinism and superiority in Europe. This very early beginning of the 20th century was characterized by optimism, innovation and a celebration of human achievement. Sadly, this period of relative global tranquility did not last for long, considering the start of World War I only 14 years later. It took until 1937 before another fair in Paris was held. Thanks for watching and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Till the next time.